start recording. Okay, so colonialism, coloniality and historical underdevelopment. Before we kind of get started with that, I want to first just briefly talk about some terms, because sometimes we use terms interchangeably, and it's not necessarily always the same thing, right? So the first term that we'll be using a lot is imperialism. Now, imperialism is basically the concept of exerting control over another country. So taking over another country and ruling that country, that's considered imperialism. So some historical examples of imperialism is the first time that it was kind of used, this term imperial and empire, was when Rome was occupying parts of Europe. When China took over parts of Vietnam and basically Southeast Asia, that was also imperialism. And so imperialism is really anything where a country takes over parts of other people that it doesn't, that's not part of their culture, right? So colonialism is very linked to imperialism. And in fact, most people use the terms interchangeably because colonialism is a form of imperialism. And the distinction is very, very small. And really the only distinction is that colonialism involves the settling of people. So you are sending people to go settle another country, whereas imperialism doesn't necessarily involve colonization. It doesn't necessarily involve sending people to another country to go settle there, right? So the British, for example, they exercised, they had imperialist policies to take over Ghana, but then what they also did was send British settlers to go live in Ghana and to manage it. And that's why it was seen as colonialism, right? And so that's kind of the difference between imperialism and colonialism. Any comments on that? Anything that's unclear? Okay, makes sense. Are you following me still? You guys probably knew all of this already, but so maybe I'm just boring you. Okay, the next term is sovereignty. Now, sovereignty, we'll also use that quite a lot, but sovereignty basically means the right of a people to be recognized as their own sovereign, independently managed country. So a country has sovereignty when they can make decisions over who rules them and how they are ruled, without people from another country making those decisions on them. Today, for example, Mongolia has sovereignty. Mongolia can decide who rules Mongolia, and it's Mongolians that decide who gets to rule Mongolia to some extent. And so that is an example of a country being sovereign, right? Then another term that we'll be using is development. Now, I want to ask you guys how you would define development. Can anyone tell me how you would define development? Anyone want to try defining development? Can you guys hear me? I'm suddenly wondering if maybe you can't even hear me.
Okay, let me try.
Okay, thanks, Abdullah.
The development is a concept of a situation that a country can afford, that can afford or I don't know, an economic system can do something for their own, like provide food, electricity, something like that. I don't know.
Okay. Yep. Yes, I think you're quite spot on. Stefan also says where the needs of people are met. So all of these are different ways to define development. And the thing with development is that it is a category that, or it is a term that many people can kind of, many people have defined in different ways, and that's okay. Many different countries define it in a different way, but generally development talks about a state of needs being met, or of certain um, uh, of people, resources being efficiently allocated, in that sense, right? So from an economic point of view, if a country, if most of the needs in a country are met, and we don't mean like needs in the survival sense of the word, right? We mean needs in the economic sense of the word, where people have a demand for something and the demand is being met. So the more demands are being met, the more developed an economy might become, right? So in that sense, there's no you've reached a certain level of development and after that, there's nothing better. That doesn't exist. Development can always improve over time. So yeah, definitely development is something that is defined by each country, and that's perfectly okay. If we look at, for example, the poorest country today, their level of development is much higher than the richest country 100 years ago. And so more demands are being met by the market or by people today than they were 100 or 200 years ago. And so in that sense, development does change all the time. Okay, what constitutes as well developed is different, because it depends on the amount of needs that are being met. Okay, thanks, Abdullah. That was good. Next, the last thing that I just want to mention as well is the idea of race, right? So I think as a South African, it's very interesting, the whole idea of race. And in Rwanda as well, I think there's a very powerful example of how the term race was used to uphold a certain system of oppression, right? If we look at the history, there are some, we obviously know that what we sometimes call racial differences really are just genetic markers that are different in some people. And so through like historical evolution, some people have certain characteristics that are different from other people. And that's what we call race. But the way that we classify one people as one race and another people as another race is very strange, right? Great example is that people classify white Caucasians as a race. And even though within that big bucket of Caucasians, there's a lot of variety, people with blue eyes, with green eyes, with brown eyes, but somehow only the skin is considered as the thing that divides people between races. And so historically, race has been used as a vehicle to justify oppression. And no place has that been more powerfully and beautifully metaphorized than in South Africa, who actually codified into law a lot of the racial segregation and the disadvantage between various races. So when we talk about race today, it's important to understand that race is something that we as humans invented in order to uphold certain systems, right? Race is not necessarily something that we can, that makes a lot of sense outside of a social setting. Okay. Any comments before I move on to the next section?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Mandy.
Yes, I have a thought. I really liked the example you have taken with the South African case. And I agree with you that race identity has questioned so many people in South Africa, and I just liked the example you have taken of it.
Okay. Good. Yeah, and I mean, even Rwanda, the idea of race as being something that is dividing people um, has also been used to uphold a certain system of oppression, right? So okay, um, the reality though, despite the fact that we have invented race to divide people, is that when we consider economics, there is a big division between various races based on economics. Again, in South Africa, if we look at the average white person, their income is considerably higher than the average black person. And that has nothing to do with any biological reason. It has everything to do with a social reason, right? And that's what I mean when I say that race is something that we invented as a social construct. And as a result, its effects are social effects. Black people in South Africa are generally poorer, not because they are not intelligent or something like that, but because historically they have been disadvantaged on an economic level, and that injustice still remains. So that's really what we are going to be talking about today, is what are some of those parts of colonialism that still remain today, even though we might no longer have the legal instance of colonialism, right? And so I want to talk about three sorts of themes that we are going to be talking about today. I see Abdullah is saying homophobia versus racism. Oh, please elaborate. What do you mean by that? It's an interesting thing. So yeah, thank you for saying that. But
Okay, so I'm a little bit confused about the two words. So I don't know what exactly because some people, myself included, mix the two words racism and homophobia. So if you can please just clarify for me.
Okay, sure. So homophobia has to do with uh, homophobia has to do with homosexuality, and so homosexuality as a practice, if people dislike that or have a certain fear response to that or an anger response to people being homosexual, that is considered homophobia. Whereas racism has to do with race. So it's about saying and someone can be considered as racist, or a word or a sentence or something can be considered racist when people distinguish between races in a negative way. And there are some, oh my gosh, suddenly my English is failing me. If there are stereotypes and prejudice is the word I'm looking for. If people have prejudice against people of different races, that's considered racism. But homophobia has to do with homosexuality. So if you have a prejudice against people who are of a different sexual orientation than you, that is considered homophobia. Does that make sense, Abdullah?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Great. So both those elements kind of have to do with this idea of what is called othering, right? And it's similar to chauvinism, which is about not valuing women and valuing men more than women. And so what all of these things have to do with what is called othering. So we basically we tell a person, or we think about a person that is different from us as being fundamentally other than us. So they are not the same, and because they are not the same and they are something other, we have certain rights, and it's okay for us to do certain things to them, right? Because this person is homosexual, we can hit them, we can deny them certain job opportunities because they are other, they're not like me. So I don't need to have empathy for them. The same thing with chauvinism, to say that this is a woman, so it's okay for me to be rude to her. It's okay for me to take things from her. It's okay for me to hit her. because she's other. She's not like me. She's different. So I don't need to have empathy with her. And this is the foundation upon which colonialism was built, is a racist othering, to say that we are not all humans. In fact, some humans are other to us. And so we as Europeans, we don't need to be empathetic towards a person with black skin, because they don't matter as much, because they are other, they are different. So we don't need to have that empathy. And so in that sense, all of these things together is what is called an othering. And that's why when people talk about social issues, specifically social justice issues, it's always a problem when we come across people who other others, to say that that person is different. So we should treat them differently, and we shouldn't have empathy because they are other, right? And so that's kind of the foundation of that. Cool. Does anyone have any other points to make about this? Because I know it can be quite a contested and interesting conversation. Anyone want to jump in with a comment or two? Yes, Mandeg.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes. This session really reminds me of a series, of a Black Mirror series, where they were having soldiers to kill people, to extend people, and then when soldiers had something, an implant in their brain, so they couldn't visualize and see the human behind the target. And when a soldier discovered it, they tried to explain to him that those are not acceptable in the society. Those are genetically inferior than those who were chosen. So I feel like racism for me looks like people choosing themselves from other people. It's like, I'm good enough, you're not good enough. I deserve to survive, you don't deserve to exist. Therefore, we need to go against you. So yeah, it reminds me of that series.
Yeah, fantastic point. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's exactly what othering is convincing people that you are different. You don't matter as much, so you don't need to have empathy. And I think as animals, we are particularly empathetic animals. We naturally live in groups, and so empathy is part of our nature. It's part of our social conditioning. And so we need to be convinced not to be empathetic. We need to be convinced that someone is not worthy of being human, so that we can do inhumane things to them. And that's, I think, where all of this colonialism comes from. So today we'll talk about three of the sort of big themes around how colonial imperialism existed and sustained itself, right? So we'll be talking a little bit about the psychological component, the economic component, and then the political component, okay? And all of these things sort of reinforced one another. So in a sense, someone is psychologically told that because you have a black skin, you are inferior, you're not as good a leader. White people are more intelligent, they're more better leaders, they are better thinkers, they're more innovative, they're more powerful, all of these things. And so when you believe that, it means that you are not going to prosper in whatever it is that you do end up doing, because you've been told from a young age that you don't really matter. And as a result, people maybe don't get good jobs, they don't innovate, they don't create a lot of businesses, which creates an economic inferiority. And that economic inferiority then gets used as to say, see, this is why black people are inferior, because look how poor they are. And so it's a really reversed sort of system that sustains itself. Similarly to that, also within the political sphere, if you tell someone for long enough that you don't know how to rule yourself or others around you, that becomes true, because people are told from a young age that you can't even think properly until the white man tells you how to think. and then that becomes a sort of psychological colonialism that causes political colonialism to exist as well. And we'll be talking a little bit about some of these things, but I just wanted to mention some of the principles. So when we talk about economic colonialism, there were some there are some elements. Last week's lecture, we spoke about the dependence theory, and how, economically speaking, countries in the colonial periphery were kind of told to keep producing commodities, whereas those in Europe and America were told to produce manufactured goods, right? Value-added goods. And what that means from an economic point of view is that those producing agricultural and commodities, they kept getting diminishing returns. So the more they produce, the less profit they make from producing more and more. Whereas those in the industrial core, those in Europe and America, the more they produced of their manufactured goods and sold it back to the dependent colonies, the more money they got, the more profits. And so Prebisch Singer was it's two economists from I think Brazil or Argentina, I forget, but Latin America, and they came up with the dependence theory to notice how even if they at the time were no longer legally colonies, economically they were still very dependent, and so that economic dependence created a colonialism without the legality thereof. Then we also have Robinson and Rodney, who both talk about the creation of what they call the black proletariat or the dark proletariat, of people living below subsistence levels. And so if we think about capitalism as a sort of pyramid, what they propose is that the only reason why European living standards increased is because they were able to add to that pyramid a bunch of black people on which to elevate themselves. And so we are still in a pyramid, but now it is the black people at the bottom who are carrying all of the Europeans who can have good quality middle-class lives in Europe. So it's an interesting point. Lindo is saying that propaganda also plays a huge role in this, and perfectly right, especially when we talk about the psychological component of that. And if we look at the political sphere, we see people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who talks about the color line, right? And he basically talked about how along the lines of color, so many positive and negative virtues are ascribed to people. Someone is hardworking when they are on one side of the color line, and on the other side of the color line, they're considered evil and dangerous and overly sexualized and all of these things. Walter Rodney also talked about the role of the Christian church in legitimizing European governments. And so this I find particularly interesting, coming back to Lindo's point about propaganda. So in the colonial setting, we obviously didn't have mass media, but we did have a propaganda machine. And the most important propaganda machine was the Christian church, who came to Africa and told Africans that the white man is not only blessed by God, but also is the only way that you can get to heaven and be happy in this life. And so listen to the white man because they know more than you do. And there's a lot of legitimizing oppression because of the Christian church. So it's a fascinating thing that I want to discuss in just a moment. And the last component that we'll be talking about is the psychological component. And here we can read things like Frantz Fanon, who talks about the alienation and objectification of the Black body, right? Where people, I think this is probably much more pronounced a few generations ago, but the idea of feeling like you are alienated from your own body. You can't even understand how to live in this body because what is inside of your mind doesn't agree with what everyone is telling you about this body of yours. Your body feels intelligent, your body feels powerful, your mind feels intelligent, your mind feels powerful, your mind feels good, but then everyone is telling body is negative, and there is no black person that can be good. Black people are lazy, and so if you are hardworking, you are basically just white. You are a white person trapped in a black body. And so there's that alienation and objectification of the black body. And that's, I think, much more powerful a few generations ago, but still can persist even today. Then we also have Ndlovu Gatseni, who talks about thought colonialism, right? And this I find also particularly fascinating because he talks about how uh, the emulation of whiteness comes to the point where we don't even know where the epistemic line is, right? So epistemic, let me just write it, epistemology. Epistemology is the study of truth, right? And so what Ndlovu Gatseni says is that in many ways, the Africans have been told how to understand things from a certain truth. And that truth is a truth defined by the European. And so it is important for us to not just cross the color line, but also the thought line, also the epistemic line, right? So great example is if we are, if I'm teaching economics and in my textbook, I have an example of inflation in the United States. The first step is to say, wait, I don't need to learn inflation in the United States. I need to learn inflation in Rwanda because I am situated in Rwanda. But that is only the first step to decolonization. The second step is to cross the epistemic line, to say that, why am I teaching inflation in the first place? And even how am I teaching? Because the way that I am teaching might be a way that is designed and developed in Europe for Europeans. And so it's not enough that I just relocate the discussion into Africa. I also need to question the way that I understand truth fundamentally. Okay, cool. And then the last quote is Chinua Achebe: "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." So again, to Lindo's point, it's very important who gets to tell the story. Because if we are talking about, if we allow other people to tell the story on our behalf, they will always tell it from their vantage point. So it's important for us to be part of the narrative. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into all of these topics, and then we can open the discussion line, and I want to hear what you guys think about it. And I'm seeing some things on the chat. Lane is asking, some historians argue that racism during colonialism was simply an organizing principle for resource-based conquering activities. They argue that racism was a justification for colonization, just wasn't actually a driver for it. You can decide what you think about this argument. Okay. Europeans wanted to enslave and steal, so they justified their actions with the idea that they were spreading Christianity to help the colonized. It's an interesting question. So we don't necessarily know what came first. Was it first the racism and then the exploitation of resources, or was it first the exploitation of resources and then the racism to justify that? Okay, so let's start by talking about the political component, okay? And here we are talking about how in Europe colonialism was legitimized through racism and Christianity, right? Now, I want to ask you this question: in what way do these political colonial aspects persist even after the end of legal colonialism? Okay. And this is where I want to leave it to you guys. What do you think about when we are talking about elements of political oppression, things like making sure that Black people cannot rule themselves, that they are convinced that they are incapable of ruling themselves. And in many ways, that they are only allowed to have an influence about ruling themselves if they are educated according to the white man's education, right? And then also this element of the Christian church and Christianity playing a vital role in saying this is a legal government, this is a illegal government, this is a good government, and this is a bad government. Do you think that these things persist even today? And if so, in what way? Ichi asks, can the practice of Christianity by Africans be considered as Stockholm syndrome? Interesting. For those who don't know, Stockholm syndrome is a syndrome observed in psychology, where if you are abused by someone, you end up having a lot of love towards them. So if someone abuses you very horribly, people have a certain affection and love for someone that has abused them. And that's something that psychologists have observed in victims of abuse. So it's an interesting point. What do you guys think about that? Do you think practicing Christianity is a form of Stockholm syndrome?
I think from my own experience, I'd say it actually is. I mean, for example, you find that people talk a lot about Botswana and how it didn't necessarily go through colonialism and it was like a British protectorate, but significantly a part of the history of Botswana and how it actually became a British protectorate actually centers around how missionaries came to Botswana, and that is how more or less we got introduced to the white people. And because missionaries were preaching Christianity and how good it is, along the way, a lot of the culture was washed away, as well as ways of doing things that I'm sure like it's kind of pretty obvious at a basic level. But what is more, I think, important around the topic of Christianity and maybe the Stockholm syndrome is the fact that Christianity teaches a lot of submission. And I think that is one of like the most important things about why Christianity was important in terms of imperialism, if we may put it that way, in the sense that because of the many principles that Christianity really enforces, it was directly translated into how people lived their way of life and how much they questioned things around governance, how much they participated in general, like citizenry or stuff like that. But it is something that is really, really major. And I don't want to put too much of my personal opinion without this becoming a discussion. But yeah, I'd like to just say that around Isha's point to say, I strongly believe it is a huge contributor to like the Stockholm syndrome.
Okay, interesting point. Anyone else? Thanks for that, Lynette. There's some interesting points in there. What do the rest of you guys think? Do you think that, because what I pick up from Lynette is that there is an element of believing in Christianity because you are told it's superior and somehow you get convinced into thinking that it is, but it's not necessarily that you would really think that it is. It's just that this colonial force, this power comes to tell you that this is the best way. Is there a space for people to believe in a religion without it being linked to a colonial situation? I'm asking that because I think that there is. I think that there is space for people to believe in spirituality or religion that is not necessarily connected to the political sphere thereof, right? And the reason why I think this is if we look at, for example, Christianity, even the early formation of Christianity was very much against power dynamics. It was very much against was a very subversive thing that was not trying to exert power over other people. It later became that, and I think it is very possible to experience a religion or a spiritualistic experience, to have that without it being a sort of power dynamic where people are trying to get you to do certain things. Unfortunately, colonialism did make Christianity something that was used, and Islam, I'm seeing on the chat as well, that was used to subvert people and to exert power over them. But it is very possible for you to experience Islam or Christianity without feeling like you are subjected to some sort of power dynamic. At least that's my own opinion. I don't know what you guys think.
I personally think that my experience around that as an African will always kind of have a bias, especially in terms of Christianity and Islam. But I also think, to reinforce what you're saying, in my own perspective, I personally believe that the only religious or spiritual kind of belief that would exist without having power dynamics involved, from my own personal experience, would be the African traditional practices that we had prior to colonialism, right? As an African, that's why I'm like, from my own perspective, I feel like that is the only view that I personally feel can exist, which may differ from what others may think.
Okay, interesting point. Anyone else want to say something? Maybe let's, if you don't want to say something about the religious aspect, what about the rest of the aspects around education and just generally Africans being told that you can't rule yourself, you don't know how to rule yourself? Do you think there are elements of that propaganda of that might still exist? Yes, Solomon?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes, I think there's a debate which has been going on for decades now about the way Africans, we are not conscious of human rights. I'll give an example of the way the Rwandan president is usually, you know, given such questions that Rwanda is not observant of human rights, same for very many other East African countries. So there's still that sense, especially in Europe, that we as Africans don't know the basics or the fundamentalities of observing human rights, for example. And there's always that debate that goes on about democracy, that democracy is not observed. If a country, for example, like Rwanda, if the president gets voted by 98% of the people, it's considered not democratic, for example. But if it's more like a tie, for example, then it's more democratic. So there's that question of whether democracy is African, is defined by Africans, by our people, or if democracy is the idea by the West that there needs to be such a great battle. One party cannot, for example, do a very good job. We saw that example in Libya. So there's still that idea that we as Africans don't know how to rule ourselves. We don't know the fundamentals of human rights, democracy, and all that. And yeah, it's seen in politics, and even sadly, the views of very many political parties, especially the opposition parties, usually think that because there's a leading party, then you get the idea. Yeah. I don't know what others think about it.
That's a very excellent point. Yeah, it's the same narrative to say that Africans don't know how to rule themselves. They need to be educated in the United Kingdom to learn how to rule themselves. this is something that we saw 100 years ago, but even today we still have the same principle of telling Africans that you don't know how to rule yourselves, right? Yeah, excellent example of Rwanda even. When all of these in the United States, when it came out, all of the Guantanamo Bay debacle and the massive human rights violations that existed there and to some extent still exist, no one said that Americans don't know how to rule themselves and they are just those kinds of people who don't know how to rule themselves, and we need to intervene and take over their governments and tell them how to rule themselves, because there is not that history of that narrative to say that they are inferior. So yeah, it's very good. The ICC is another example of this. Yeah, interesting point. Yes, Mandeg?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, so basically, in my country, in Djibouti, we still have the effects of the political effects of colonization that is still happening. Djibouti has three ethnics: Somalis, Afars, and Arabs. And colonizers, the French colonizers, were more entitled, or were more doing exchange and dealing with Somalis, and then when they were leaving the country, they give the power to the Somalis. Till now, they still claim that the only people that can rule that land are Somalis. Afars and Arabs cannot rule Djibouti, and it got to a point where people have believed those type of standards, where Somalis are better than Arabs and Afars, and now it's even creating chaos whenever elections are going to happen in Djibouti. It creates a huge debate. People are lost. Society do not speak about it, and I just believe that colonization, what colonizers do when they leave a land, is to divide then, so that later on those people from that land could not have the chance to develop themselves and have the same standards, political standards of the colonization's country.
Yep.
That's my point.
Yep, excellent point. Divide and conquer was the maxim of colonization. And we can see that in every single country that was colonized, the British were especially good at this, to come in and identify a country that has a group within a country and creating very clear divisions between the different groups. And in many cases, those groups were artificially created, as is the case in Rwanda. And so those groups were kind of not only artificially created, but then explicitly used to divide people so that there can be no national unity. Same thing happened in Nigeria, same thing in South Africa, same thing in Ghana, same thing in Kenya, all over. Some ethnic group was selected for their supposed better intelligence or whatever. And in many cases, they were explicitly selected because they were maybe numerically inferior. And so it's easier to tell the small amount of Igbo that you guys should be rulers because you are very intelligent, much better than the more numerous Hausa and Yoruba, and you should rule. And to then prioritize and rule, cause one ethnic group to be the kind of middlemen rulers is a very good way to divide people so that they can't unify against you. Yeah, great point. Anything else that you want to mention? Eche is saying that Christianity and colonization helped each other. It was a symbiotic relationship. So true. I think if we look at the spread of Christianity through, I read an article about the East India Trading Company, and how in the beginning there was a lot of animosity between, not a lot of friendship between the British East India Trading Company and the Christian Church, and they were a little bit enemies. because the church said, you guys are just obsessed about profits, and the business people were saying, no, you just want to love the native and raise them up. You don't want to, and you want to condemn us for being hard-handed or things like that. And that was the beginning of the relationship, but then later it evolved into this thing where the one would not go without the other, because they realized just how much power they have if they go together. And people are much more willing to listen to your teaching about Jesus when they have a gun next to their head. And at the same time, people are much more willing to work for no profit, to work at very low labor wages, if they are convinced that they are going to heaven. So it's a very symbiotic relationship, yes. Okay. Yes, Lynette.
I think for me, just speaking about the business side of things and going back to like the initial question asked, I just thought about how beyond like the conversation about Christianity, the corporate space that we kind of exist in as well at this kind of moment in time, tying it in with identity and issues around sexism also kind of ties in with this matter that we're actually talking about now, about how with the colonial like effects that still left even after the legal end of colonialism, things such as like feeling inadequate as, let's say, a woman in a boardroom, or feeling as though there needs to be friction between females and males, and different conversations about feminism and other things. I feel like those are some of the many conversations that exist almost as a distraction from the greater issue at hand, being the imperialism that still exists, especially in a very economic manner. So I feel like that is another thing that, another conversation that is usually not had, but kind of is very significant in terms of how even today there's still very different holds in terms of colonialism over people who since we're all African, people who are African, for example. So I think that is another very critical element of the conversation as well.
Yep, good point. Thanks, Lynette. You're so right. I think people, it's easy to get distracted. But what is important to understand is that what underpins sexism, what underpins homophobia, what underpins racism, all of it is supported by this idea that we are not all humans, that somehow there is an other, and this person that is other, it's okay for us to do certain horrible things to them. It's okay for us to pay them a lower wage. It's okay for us to treat them differently. It's okay for us to ignore them in many cases. All of that is part of an othering. And so if you get rid of the othering, if you get rid of the idea that people are other than you and we are not all humans, suddenly all of those things can kind of go away, and you can see the more bigger systemic issues which are resulting of colonialism. Yeah. Solomon asks, isn't the migration crisis in Europe an example of how the idea that Western European superiority is still a big thing or belief in Africa? Yes, I completely agree with you. I think the mere fact that people who in many cases actually participated in the creation of a war in the Middle East, but they're unwilling to deal with the consequences of human displacement. And I think this is something particularly interesting that Lane will be discussing with you guys in a week or two, around the forced displacements and conflict theory. And so I'm looking forward to that and to understand how the sense of Western superiority ties in with that movement of people. Okay, I'm just a little bit worried about time, so let me quickly move on to, of course, my favorite component of this is the economic components of colonialism that might still be persisting. And I want to talk about a little bit about what we call subsistence. So you might remember from last year, if you are IBT, what we mean by subsistence. But for those in GC, an economist talks about subsistence as a level of income that basically is just enough to sustain you, right? It is there. If you subsist, it means that you produce just enough to get to the next day. You basically just farm enough so that you can eat it and live to the next day, to farm again and eat it, and live to farm again the next day and eat it. So that is what is called subsistence, right? And generally under feudalism, we spoke a little bit about what feudalism is a while back, but under feudalism, the serfs were generally kept at subsistence, which means that they produced just enough to survive, just enough to feed themselves and their families and to get to the next day so that they can continue farming and get to the next day after that. There was no surplus. So in economic terms, surplus is basically something that you can keep for a rainy day or keep to expand your opportunities. Surplus is what you use to maybe buy new equipment so that you can work better or faster. It's money that you can use to educate yourself and maybe do something else. It's money that you can use to buy a bigger field. It's money that you can use to basically do anything apart from just surviving, right? And so under feudalism, serfs were kept at subsistence. And what that meant is that they didn't have any time to organize rebellions or to be dissatisfied or to have real problems in life or to actually do anything about the real problems they had in life. And there are very few cases technically about where we see mass peasant revolts because the majority of peasants and serfs didn't really have the time or the capacity to go and be politically active. And so that's one of the good things about being at subsistence levels is you can oppress large amounts of people if they are at subsistence level because they don't have the time and the energy to go and do anything outside of just surviving to the next day, right? And so the great thing about capitalism is that it allowed people to supply labor at a competitive negotiation. So it meant that the serf could say, I don't want subsistence level. I want to negotiate my labor. I want to get paid a little bit more. And if you were a serf that was exactly the same as every other serf, you know how to plow a field, then you had very little power in that negotiation, because if I ask too high a wage, you can just go and take Mandeg's labor instead, or Solomon, or any of the other thousands of people that know how to plow a field, right? But if you were a serf that maybe knew a little bit better than everyone else, so you were not, you maybe knew a little bit about how to bake good breads, and so it's not very easy to replace you, then you are able to negotiate a little bit better of compensation. And so then you might be getting paid labor that is above subsistence, right? It means that you are able to extract a little bit more value out of what you do with your life. And so instead of just getting money to eat for that day and enough money to go and eat and continue working tomorrow, you have a little bit extra more money. And that extra money you can save and gradually buy your own flour, you can buy your own bakery shop, and gradually you become someone who is no longer a serf, but someone who is able to negotiate a more competitive wage labor, right? Now, the thing that happened during colonial capitalism is that laborers were in many cases pushed to supply labor at below subsistence levels. So what that means is that colonial subjects were paid less than what it costs them to survive, right? So that means that, and Walter Rodney writes about this in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which I highly recommend. Some of the chapters are part of the required reading. But Walter Rodney explains how in many cases, and he gives historical examples of someone doing exactly the same job in Lagos as a person doing that job in Wales. And because that person is in Wales, they get paid a lot more money than the person in Lagos, because the person in Wales doesn't own land. Because of feudalism and the way that feudalism spread in Europe, very few poor people actually owned land. And so a poor person working in a mine needed all of the money to just survive. So they needed to be paid, let's say, £1, so that they can buy food for £1, eat it that day, eat it tomorrow, and work again tomorrow, so that they can get another pound to eat again the day after that. And so they subsisted on £1. But the Nigerian mine worker, most of them had land. And so they were able to also farm their own vegetables. So they didn't need to work for subsistence. They already worked for subsistence in their own small farm holdings. They needed money for other reasons, to buy surplus things. And so what very soon happened was the colonial enterprise made sure that that Nigerian doesn't get £1, which is the equivalent of subsistence for a normal human at that time, but instead that the Nigerian worker would get less than subsistence for their wage. And because they get less than subsistence, the owner of the mine knows that they won't die, because they also have their small farm where they can still get food. So it's okay if we pay them 10 cents instead of a full pound, because they can still subsist on their own land. And so the result was that African wages were much lower than European or American labor. And that still persists until today, even, where somehow it's justified to pay Africans less than Europeans or Americans, even when they work on the continent, because it's seen as we need to justify their standard of living or something like that. And that's, in my mind, quite interesting, and a very good example of how economic colonialism still persists even today. Okay, so next question is, what do you guys think? What other effects of economic colonialism still exists even after the end of legal colonialism? And I've just talked about one very small thing. I know we have talked in class last year, if you were with me in IBT, we talked about a great many other things. So what do you guys think? What other economic aspects of colonialism still exists today? Consultant rate or expert rate. What do you mean by that, Eche?
Really trying to avoid turning on my mic, but yeah. So what I meant by the consultant rate or expert rates are like when say someone from a non-African or non-African country comes to like an African country and they're paid higher than the Africans, isn't that considered like a consultant's rate or an expert's rate, like in contrast to the way you're putting it as an economic colonialism, you get? And secondly, what I wanted to put on that is that, like, again, what goes into mind when that is done most times, I believe, is they consider the purchasing power parity. Say this person is coming from somewhere that bread here might cost lesser than bread in USA. So now they'll increase the amount that they're paying that person to match the amount that the person will be paid when the person is in their own country. Yeah, because now ideally the person is not moving their family down to this place. So now for the person to take care of their family, they'll probably have to pay the person more to kind of match the standard that they are, like the purchasing power of goods and materials from where the person is coming from. And again, if you if you twist it like or transverse it, if an African comes through as well, if, say an African American or something, so an African has lived in America for a while, comes to Africa under such guise as a consultant or as an expatriate, they still pay them the same amount as their white counterparts. So I'm just trying to find it. I'm just trying to like understand like from what point you're coming from. Are you saying that people are majorly paid more according to their race when they're here, or are you saying people from different countries that are not African, when they come to Africa, they get to be paid more because of an economic colonialist mindset?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I get you. And that's a good question. I think it is much more complex than I might have given the impression, right? So in the example that I used, it was exactly the same work with exactly the same expertise and exactly the same needed qualification to do exactly the same thing. And there was a difference in that. And that I think is not justifiable. But if we have someone with rare skills coming to a different country and they have they need to resettle and live in a different country, there might be an economic incentive to pay that person more because they are bringing a rare skill. And because we know from supply and demand, if it's rare, the supply is lower, right? So that means that the price would be higher for someone with a rare skill. So that makes sense. And that I don't think is an element of colonialism. That's probably just an element of supply and demand. Where it becomes colonial is when someone is doing exactly the same thing with no perceivable more skill or more knowledge or more expertise, and they're not resettling into a different country, but somehow people are paid different salaries. That's, I think, part of what I would say has colonial history, saying that it's okay to pay someone less, not because they are less skilled or they are less experienced or they have for any other reason apart from the fact that Africans are okay with low living standards. You know, they're happy in their mud huts, so we don't need to pay them a lot because just look at how happy they are. That is what I mean by this colonial stance. Does that make sense, Eche?
Yes, it does make sense. It does make sense.
Okay, and this might maybe shock some of you, but I have been in conversations and heard people say these exact same things. I once had the pleasure of listening to a businessman who worked in Malawi and told me that yes, when you do business in the rest of Africa, you should be very careful not to pay people too much money because they might just become dependent on you and lazy. And so it's important to pay them market rate. Don't pay them more. Don't pay them what you think is fair. Just pay them market rate, and that's fine. And that's exactly what I mean. That element of colonialism still persists even today. Mandeg is saying, I believe even African labor or African products are less valuable than European labor or products. Yes, tell me what you mean by that, Mandeg.
So basically what I was saying from that point of view is that till today, African products and African labor are not trusted in the world. If you are trying to sell an African product, people mostly think of this product might be fake or something. They don't think as it is. It doesn't have value for them. This is like this. What shocks me, like people, it might be fake or it might not have the value as much as a French brand making the same thing. So that's what I am saying by that comment, if I make sense.
Yeah, okay. No, I hear you. So it has more to do with our perception of it, which is part of maybe an element of propaganda, or just the way that we tell our own stories, to kind of assume that there's an inferiority to African-made products. Good point. I also saw Lane is saying how sometimes it's people justify paying low salaries to Africans because African economies are depressed, right? Or are in generally have lower standards of living. And it's an interesting point because I think in many cases it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we are okay with paying Africans low salaries, then there is not a lot of money going around. And as you might know from economics, is that the more money there is to go around, the better it is for the entire economy, right? And so then things are depressed because people pay people low salaries. And that is historically rooted also in colonialism. If the colonial powers did not spend their colonial money in the colonies, but instead spent it in Europe, that money got circulated in Europe and created a lot of value there, as opposed to not in Africa. And so that is kind of why we are at a place where many African economies are depressed and where the standard of living is quite low, because we've been okay with paying people low salaries. So the chicken and the egg situation. Okay. Eche says, on what you said last, isn't that just an element of capitalism, i.e. maximizing profits at the least? Literature about the way that capitalism and colonialism really empowered each other. And some people go so far as to say that you can't have capitalism without colonialism. And the only way that colonialism came into existence is because capitalism came into existence. So we shouldn't have been surprised that colonialism happened, because capitalism kind of created the conditions thereof, right? I am not so sure if I'm as negative about capitalism as that. I think there is hope for capitalism, and I think there's a type of capitalism which is a very competitive type of capitalism, devoid of morals, that, yes, maybe colonialism existed, but I do think that there are some elements of capitalism that we can still benefit from. Slave trade, not colonialism. Yes, I think slave trade and colonialism also went hand in hand. And I also think that you couldn't have one without the other. Yeah. So the next question that I wanted to quickly talk is about the psychological component. And I just want to mention one thing that I haven't mentioned before, which is this idea of humanity, right? And so this comes down to what I mentioned earlier about the epistemic line, is instead of saying that, the first step is to say that a Black person, an African, is human, right? And they can be just as hardworking, just as intelligent, just as educated as any white person, right? That's the first step. But I think that is still a lie, because in that statement, just by me saying that a Black person is just as human as a white person, they can be as intelligent and as hardworking as any white person, do you see that I am linking your concept of what it means to be human with your ability to work hard and your ability to be intelligent, right? And so what happened, especially in the first part of the 1900s, was a bunch of Black thinkers and philosophers trying to tell the world that we are also human by your standards. We are also human by the way that you define humanity. But what we've seen since is a movement away from that, which is called epistemic decolonization of thought, to say that actually the way that you define human is not the same way that we define human. And so if we think of the classic Descartes saying that I think, therefore I am, his humanity was very much an individual thing, right? It is about how am I perceiving my own humanity? How do I know that I exist? And the way that I know I exist is because of my conscious, rational thought. So I have my own thoughts inside of me as an individual person, and I can therefore take those thoughts and it can exist, and that makes me human, right? Sartre also talked about how the violence is the means by which the colonizer became man, because the way that he understood European humanity is to say that what makes you a man, and specifically a masculine man, not a human, but what makes you a man, masculine man, is the power to exert power over another. If you can influence someone or convince someone or get someone to do something, you are masculine. And so masculinity is defined within the terms of individual conquest. If I myself as an individual is able to conquer this woman, if I myself as an individual is able to conquer this job, if I myself am able to conquer this difficult task, this gym regiment, this whatever it might be, I therefore become a man. And so my conquest of humanity, my being human, is firstly individual, and secondarily, it has to do with my ability to use intellect in a way that dominates others, right? And that contradicts very strongly with the idea of Ubuntu, which is especially a Bantu conception of humanity. And I think most Bantu languages, even in Kinyarwanda, the word Ubuntu refers to human, right? And so it's a very common thing that in South Africa, I think that the term that we use is Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Gabantu. And I am butchering that, so please don't tell any Xhosa person that's how I pronounced it. But it basically means I am.
After this.
How, Lynette, please. And I'm seeing Lindo Kushle is there as well. Please be quiet. But the idea is that I am because we are. And so defining your own humanity is definitely not an individual pursuit. It is realizing your place within a community. And so in many cultures on the continent, how you became recognized as a man was not when you were able to prove by some feat or exploit or some amazing thing you did that you are somehow worthy of being a man. The way that you were told you are man is when you were able to fit into your community. When you went through a ritual to show that you are part of this collective. You are not an individual, you are part of this collective. And so that is how humanity is defined. And so imagine these two things conflicting in a colonial setting, where on the one side you have Europeans arriving without any community whatsoever in the middle of your country, just arriving without a community, telling you how to rule your lives. There must have been a lot of cultural clashes that people were not even aware of, because no one really realized how big the difference is between how we define humanity. And so in that sense, the European would think that all of these Africans are not really humans, because look how none of them like stand out. None of them are trying to prove they are better than all the others. There's no king in many of these communities even. No one is ruling over anyone else. So there must be no great people here, because there's no one trying to take over everyone else. So there must be no one of importance here, right? No great men are here. And so the best way that we can look at this geographically is also to just look at the amount of walls that exist in Europe versus the amount of walls that exist in Africa. And there are many more walls in Europe than especially in Southern and East Africa, because there were fewer wars. And it might be proposed, some thinkers propose, that the reason why we see this is because there's a difference in how we define humanity. In Bantu cultures, humanity is not defined by your ability to conquest others. It is defined by your ability to be part of a community. So that's my thoughts. What do you guys think about that? How do you think are there any remnants of psychological inferiority, or the way that we define our humanity, that still perpetuate parts of colonialism? What do you think? Oh, Lane, I see you say Ubuntu also applies to Native American culture. Interesting. I didn't know they spoke Xhosa in the USA.
Well, I will say that the way that you described how Europeans justified conquering Africans by saying, look, they don't even own private property. That means no one owns this land. Those were the same justifications that Europeans used for what's called manifest destiny to justify taking over Native Americans. And they did the same thing to Native Americans as they did to Africans. And it was because Native American cultures have the same sense of collectivism that Southern African cultures have. So what you're saying translates to North American colonial project as well.
Okay, interesting. If you guys don't have any other comments, I think we are at our time anyway. Okay. The last thing that I just wanted to, and I think I probably have told you guys this before, but it's something that very powerfully illustrates this difference between a conception of humanity, is if we consider two stories. On the one side, we have Captain America, which you all know, Captain America, the hero. And then on the other side, we have Black Panther, right? So if we compare Captain America and Black Panther, in Captain America, there is a central hero, which is this, God, what's his name again? Chris Evans? Is it Chris Evans? Anyway, that guy, someone help me, please. The protagonist of Captain America.
Yeah, it's Chris Evans.
Yeah,
Okay.
he is.
Evans.
Okay, good. Okay, so you've got Chris Evans, and he is the hero because he is able, of his own power, to overcome all of the obstacles. He faces all his enemies on his own, and through his own sheer willpower and hard work and dedication and talent and commitment, he is able to able to overcome all of his challenges, right? On the other hand, and so he's the hero, he's the person that we are rooting for, and he's the one that gets things done, right? We follow his journey, his hero's journey of him achieving all of the obstacles and showing to everyone what a great person he is in the end. By contrast, we have Wakanda, who and Black Panther, and Shua T'Challa is maybe the protagonist, but he is by no means the only person doing the things. He is not overcoming even half of his obstacles. In fact, Wakanda is helping him overcome most of his obstacles. So it's not just him, it's his entire community that helps him to overcome all of the obstacles. And he is not the main feature. The story doesn't follow him overcoming all of his challenges. It follows the story of Wakanda overcoming their challenges as a collective. And so that illustrates the difference in how people are socialized to either think that your value depends on you individually overcoming circumstances, as opposed to your value comes from being a valuable member in your society so that your society can overcome their challenges. As a soldier, what is your role in making sure that this killmonger guy doesn't take over the country? As a scientist, what is your role in making sure that this killmonger doesn't take over the society? And even as a spiritual leader, what is your role? And so everyone has a role to play, and it's more of a community way of solving and following this hero's journey. It's not one hero, it is a collective. And then also the great thing is, was Killmonger wrong, right? So that complexity and understanding that there's not necessarily a right or a wrong, it is much more complex than just that. That I think is quite powerful for me in the Black Panther movie. Yes, and I am decidedly nerdy. So I will leave you guys there, and thank you very much for joining. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all on Friday, so we can see how all of this plays out in Anakirfa. Okay, have a fantastic day, and goodbye.
You mean have a fantastic evening?
Yes.